Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Charvak Podcast patron session. Today, we are going to be beginning with chapter 8 of The Horse, the Wheel, the Language by David Anthony. Let's see how much we cover. We'll try to finish half of the chapter because this chapter has a few more pages than the normal last one. So, last time we could cover it all in one go, but I don't think so. This time, we're going to be able to do that. But let's begin now. I'm going to start reading. Let me check everything is okay. Yes, everything seems good. Okay. So, chapter 8, First Farmers and Herders, the Pontic Caspian Neolithic. At the beginning of time, there were two brothers, twins, one named Man, Manu in Proto Indo European, and other twin, Yemo. They traveled through the cosmos accompanied by a great cow. Eventually, Man and twin decided to create the world we now inhabit. To do this, man had to sacrifice twin, or in some versions, the cow. For the parts of this sacrificed body, with the help of the gods, Sky Father, Storm God of War, Divine Twins, man made the wind, the sun, the moon, the sea, earth, fire, and finally all the various kinds of people. Man became the first priest, the creator of the ritual of sacrifice that was the root of world order. After the world was made, the sky gods gave cattle to third man, Treto, but the cattle were treacherously stolen by a three-headed, six-eyed serpent, Ngui, I guess, I don't know, the Proto-Indo-European for root for negation. Third man entreated the storm god to help get the cattle back. Together they went to the cave or mountain of the monster, killed it, or the storm god killed it at home, and freed the cattle. Trito became the first warrior. He recovered the wealth of the people, and his gift of cattle to the priests ensured that the sky gods received their share in the rising smoke of sacrificial fires. This ensured that the cycle of giving between gods and humans continued. These two myths were fundamental to the Proto Indo European system of religious belief. Manu and Yimo are reflected in creation myths preserved in many Indo European branches, where Yimo appears as Indic Yama, a Western Yima, Norse Ymir, and perhaps Roman Remus from Iemus, the archaic Italic form of Yemo, meaning the twin. I just want to pause here and I again want to reiterate my point that I. I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything of that sort. That it could have been that these stories might have traveled from one place to the other. I'm not denying that, but what what I don't understand is that why can't these stories be just the journey of human beings eventually who are just dealing with their environment and they just happen to come up with similar stories? I'm not saying, obviously, if somebody was to ask me, Kushal, where would you put your money on? I'll be very honest. I'll put my money on people traveling, meeting each other, and carrying stories. And as a betting man, I would put less money on the latter one, which I myself have shared with you. But I'm just putting it out there that somehow it's always in the back of my head. I always think that if I was a human being and I suddenly develop agriculture and I was living in a pre-agricultural society and just thinking in pure evolutionary terms, so how was my interaction with nature going to be as a pre-agricultural person? Obviously it was going to be everything in my nature, and my interaction with nature would have been on certain terms. So when I become post agriculture, I have to rely on these entities of nature, whether it's the wind, the air, and many other things. So would it be a natural, you know, gradual evolution of that meme from a pre-agricultural society to a post-agricultural society is something that I've constantly thought about. And while I'll still put my money on the former, I would not be surprised if the latter is also real. It's just my view. Okay, I'll read further now. And man appears as Old Indic Manu or Germanic Manus, paired with his twin to create the world. The deeds of Trito have been analyzed at length by Bruce Lincoln, who found the same basic story of the hero who recovered primordial lost cattle from a three-headed monster in Indic, Iranian, Hittite, Norse, Roman, and Greek myths. See, this is what they do. I mean, I know even Talagiri in his book talks about the myths, and he also uses the stories as a common point of out of India. I don't know if Rushal, you remember this. I think it was in the first book where he talks about it. I think uh, his Rigveda historical analysis. But I honestly, even at that time, when Talagiri had made his point, it was almost as if he was saying that yes, they used the same point, and I'm going to use this point now in my favor. I don't know. I'm just putting it out there. I always found this thing to be weird.
I think every claim this guy makes about Indic literature and myth specifically needs to be checked out as carefully as possible, because I know there's at least one guy, Shiv Shastri, who's written that book, Aryan Invasion, Myth or Fact, and he has found, like, he's identified at least one outright lie that David Anthony has told about, Rig Veda Sukta 10:18, in which Anthony claims that it is a precise description of a Kurgan burial pit. That it has a cave, a pillar, a roof, this kind of, all those things, and those words don't exist in that sukta at all.
No,
So
no. So
it's
which one are you talking about? Which Rigveda verse?
10:18. One sec. Let
Wait,
me. Let me. I'm just trying to find the book. Huh?
10:18. Okay, 10. I'm in 10.
Oh, 18. So I can't
It's
find
okay.
Shiv's book. That's the problem. I can't. My Kindle is really screwing up. I don't know what's going on today. But I mean, in fact, I'm having to use some different software to read this book also. But
Kindle needs to be vaccinated.
but
Kindle
anyway,
को COVID हो गया. Okay, I'm in 10:18.
yeah. Is there anything there about a cave, a roof, a pillar, or walls? Like he says, what David Anthony says is that 10:18 is a precise description of a Sintashta burial pit. Is a description of a place where they would bury kings.
I can
Can you?
read the entire 10:18 and share it for you guys if you want.
Sure. I mean, it may not be that important right now, but I just want, like, the reason I'm mentioning it right now, because he's not mentioning it right now. Anthony, well, I'm sure he'll come to it later on in his book also. But someone else has identified that this is one instance where Anthony has
This is
completely defrauded.
this is 10:18. Depart death along the further path, which is your own, different from the one leading to the gods. To you who possess eyes and who listen, do I speak. Do not harm our offspring nor our heroes. Effacing the footprint of death when you have gone, establishing for yourselves a longer, more extended lifetime, swelling up with offspring and wealth, become cleansed and purified, O you who are worthy of the sacrifice. These the living have turned aside from the dead. The invocation of the gods has come favorably for us today. We have gone facing toward to dancing to laughter, establishing for ourselves a longer, more extended timeline. I set down this barrier here for the living, let alone one of these later go to this goal. Let them live for 100 ample autumns. Let them conceal death with a mountain. 5. Just as the days follow each upon the last, just as the seasons follow straightaway upon the seasons, so, O ordainer, arrange their lifetime so that the later does not leave behind the earlier. 6 is mount your lifetime, choosing old age, taking your place, each following the last, as many as you are. Here will Thwastar, affording good birth in concert with the wives of the gods, make a long lifetime for you to live. Let's go to the next page. These women here, non widows with good husbands, let them, with fresh butter as ointment, approach together, without tears, without afflictions, well jeweled. Let the wives first mount the womb. Arise, women, to the world of the living. You lie beside him whose life is gone. Come here. You have come into existence now as wife of a husband who has grasped your hand and wishes to have you, taking the bow from the hand of the dead for our dominion, luster, and strength. You there and we here, may we with good heroes win all contests and hostile engagements. Creep upon this mother earth, the broad earth of wide expanse, who is very kindly. The young girl, soft as wool, for the one who gives priestly gifts, let her protect you from the lap of the dissolution. Arch up, earth, do not press down. Become easy to approach for him, easy to curl up in. Like a mother her son with her hem, cover him, earth. Let the earth stay arching up, for let 1,000 house pots be fixed in her. Let the house be dripping with ghee. Let it always be sheltering to him here. I prop up the earth from you, setting down this earth clod here. Let me not be harmed. Let the forefathers uphold this pillar for you. There let Yama fix your seats. On the day facing me today, they have set him, dead man, down like a feather for an arrow. The speech facing me, I have grasped like a horse at his altar. So it is about someone dying.
Yeah.
So I'll give
It's a
you the
funeral one. Yeah, it's about a
yeah, it
funeral.
is. So
But
I don't think
yeah,
so. It is about death, etc. So it's actually exactly about death.
Has he given a precise description of a Santashta burial pit? Like that's what David Anthony claims.
if anything, this is a burning of a pyre, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
so I can read the commentary of this too. This lovely hymn falls into several sections, each treating the end of the funeral service. The first six verses depict the mourners leaving the service and returning to their lives. Death is dismissed in verse 1, and in verses 2 to 3, the living turn back to an enhanced life full of dancing and laughter. I purposely read the verses first, and I'm reading the understanding of the translator later on. They are separated from death by a barrier, verse 4. In the latter ritual, a stone is set down near the grave. Verses 5 6 are especially concerned with the orderly sequence of life and death, in particular, the fear that the younger will die before their elders and disrupt the proper sequence. The next three verses, 7 to 9, have been much discussed, especially in the context of sati or widow burning. Through the verses are emphatically not in depiction thereof. This is the translator's reading. I did not see anything, which is why I always say read the verse, don't read the commentary. This is a proof of that. From verse 8, it appears that the widow lies down temporarily beside her dead husband, but is summoned back to life and indeed symbolically reborn to become the wife of a new husband, quite possibly her brother in law in levirate marriage. The happy woman in verse 7 apparently approached the funeral pyre to adorn the wife for her return to life. A similar return to life is granted the dead man's bow in verse 9, where someone, quite possibly the dead man's son, repossesses the bow to put it in future use. The burial in the subject of verses 10 to 13, with an emphasis on the softness and gentleness of the welcoming earth, both mother and bride, which lies lightly on the dead man. Verse 13 forms a sort of ring with verse 1, with both expressing a prohibition against harm with the same construction of the same root, rik, rish, rishab, risham. This ring defines the final verse 14 as outside the hymn proper, and other indications support this extra hymnic status. It is in dimeter meter instead of the trimeter that prevails elsewhere, and the Ashwalayana Griha Sutra, which treats the ritual usage of all the other verses, ignores it, as does the medieval commentator Sayana. The sense of this verse is also much disputed. Many scholars think that the poet is predicting his own future death on a day that is approaching him in the first hemistich, and in the second he restrains his speech in anticipation. As Geldner says rather more dramatically than usual, the rest is silent. There is silence. In contrast, we consider this to belong to the typical genre of hymn final metapoetic verses, in which the poet comments on his own skill in producing the poem that precedes. By this interpretation, the first half verse concerns the well conducted funeral that has just taken place, while the second refers specifically to the poet's taming and controlling that the speech accompanied the ritual. So I'll tell you why what I feel about this. I'll stop staring this. Well, it's obviously a burial verse. So, Vishal, I actually don't agree with you. It was not a funeral pyre. Um, it was exactly a burial verse. So, uh, as far as I'm concerned, David Anthony has assumed it to be synthesized because their first assumption has always been that the movement is from point A to point B, and then when they think that the movement is from point A to point B, they look for things inside the Rig Veda that match their own worldview. Now, in this case, if like people like us who have studied Bibi Lal's case and the archaeology of the Indus Valley civilization, what would we do? Our natural bias would be like, oh, we have seen burials in IVC and we will put them in the burials in IVC. So both of us can make that case. So I don't think so. David Anthony has committed a huge sin by comparing it to Synthasta, and we are
Because
not
you haven't seen
committing
the
a huge.
comparison, Kushal. You haven't seen the comparison. Wait a second, I'm trying to find it. Like the extent to which he claims that it's a precise description. Wait a second, I'm trying to find it. Or it's still. He goes a lot further than even we. We are not writing a book or anything here. Even in our discussions, we are much more careful about how we, make projections on the evidence in our little discussions here than what David Anthony has done. Like, yeah, he's looked for evidence. When he couldn't find evidence, he's made up evidence, fabricated it, and put it in this book. So that's one thing that he has. Yeah. Rig Veda
So what I
describes
put
the
in
covered-
is something I found from Shiv Shastri. Yeah.
Yeah, a covered burial chamber with posts holding up the roof, walls shored up, and the chamber sealed with clay. A precise description of Sintashta and Andronova grave beds. ऐसा कुछ नहीं है इसमें.
Yeah, obviously it is not as precise as he's talking about. It is talking about a burial. That's the only accurate understanding. So 10.18 talks about a burial that we have to accept. It is clearly a burial. But that burial pit, I mean, first of all, like when we were discussing Bibi Lal also, I used to say all the time कि यार जो burial यहाँ मिलते हैं वो burial वहाँ मिलते हैं. जो बरियल, अच्छा ये तो मेसोपोटामिया में भी मिलते हैं, तो क्या मेसोपोटामिया आर्यन इन्वेजन वहां से हुई है?
That is a separate issue. That we can say, even if he did find such an exact burial pit, what Anthony is describing was mentioned in the Rig Veda, even then we could use this argument कि वैसे तो कहाँ भी हो सकता है. There can be that kind of burial pit in many places. But the fact
That's
is,
exactly my point. That's what I'm trying to say.
But that is a different point. The point is that there is no description of a burial pit like this in that 1018, and David Anthony claims that there is. So he's a falsifier of evidence. Track record hai uska. So I mean, that's what I'm keeping in mind when I'm reading all his claims about this mythology of three-headed serpent. Indic mein tha. I mean, have you heard of that? I mean, I've not heard of a three-headed serpent stealing a curse. Which one is that?
I mean, I'll have to think and look back and see, but I remember the three-headed serpent story that is there. So that I'm
Stole
not
a cow
surprised.
and then Trito had to go.
Yeah. That's there. So most of these stories are there. So it's not that. And see, I have not read this book you guys are talking about, so I can't make any claims, because if David Anthony has made that claim, we will find it in the book and we will comment about it then. So I think that is the right way to do it. We should not rely on somebody else's claim of what David Anthony has said. You can read David Anthony directly is my point. We will anyway read David Anthony directly ना. So हो सकता है कि वो बंदे ने क्या तरीके से बोला होगा और इस बंदे ने उसको क्या समझ के क्या प्रेजेंट किया, वो भी तो हो सकता है ना. That is also a possibility, right? How can we rely on a third person?
Okay, I mean, that should be easy enough to establish. Does this text anywhere like posts holding up the roof does exist in, like, we can easily search the Kindle version for it.
So it's very simple. My point is very simple. It is, this verse talks about क्या बोलते हैं इसको? This talks about burial. That's about it. It doesn't talk about anything beyond that. Everything other than that is David Anthony. If this is a direct quote of David Anthony, once again I repeat, I will have to read at least 2 pages before that and 2 pages after that to get a sense of what David Anthony says.
Fair enough. See, let's see it now. Let's catch him in this lie that he's told.
Yeah. And if this is there, तो मैं तो इसको ट्विटर पे भी डालूंगा ना. मैं तो दिखाऊंगा कि ये तुम्हारा वर्स है, ये वर्स है और ये डेविड एंथनी कह रहा है. ये तो चाचा झूठ बोल रहा है ना. क्लियर है चाचे को कुछ. अरे वो तो हमने कितनी बार इस बुक में देखा है कि अब लॉट ऑफ क्लेम्स that these are made, like this is the same thing that people do with Indus Valley burials also. They say these are Vedic burials, and I've always wondered कि ये Vedic burials भी तुम कैसे prove कर. It is so generalized, this statement. Everywhere you see these burials, all ancient civilized, even Mesopotamia has the same burials, the same direction they face. बोलो अभी क्या करोगे? Direction भी वही होती है. You can check it. Don't trust me. Go and see Mesopotamian burials. Go and see Indus Valley burials. Go and see Anatolian burials. Go and see South Russian burials. All of them are the same. इसके बेस पे मतलब हर जगह से आर्यन निकल रहे थे क्या? How can we make a statement like that is my point. See, the question is that everybody has these similar stories. So everybody says, मेरे को ये जगह पसंद है, मेरे हिसाब से ये evidence है, so the movement is from here to there. In people who believe in out of India say, मेरे हिसाब से out of India है. Everybody is using the same evidence, which is the hilarious bit, by the way. Talagiri also uses the same evidence. Everybody is using the same evidence and saying this is the truth. So, I mean, who do you trust? Like I said, अपनी अक्कल लगाओ. वो कौन सी एड होती थी हमारे यहाँ पे, इस पे मत जाओ, अपनी अक्कल लगाओ. दैट्स व्हाट आई से. अपनी अक्कल लगाओ, जिसको जो करना है. I find it all very weird. I'll read further. The myth of man and twin established the importance of the sacrifice and the priest who regulated it. The myth of the third one defined the role of the warrior who obtained animals for the people and the gods. Many other themes are also reflected in these two stories. The Indo European fascination with binary doublings combined with triplets, twos and threes, which reappeared again and again. Even in the metric structure of Indo European poetry, the theme of pairs who represented magical and legal power, twin and man, Varuna Mitra, Odin Tyr. In the partition of society and the cosmos between three great functions or roles. The priest, in both his magical and legal aspects, the warrior, the third man, and the herder cultivator, the cow or cattle. Sorry, kya battle? For the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, domesticated cattle were basic symbols of the generosity of the gods and the productivity of the earth. Humans were created from a piece of the primordial cow. The ritual duties that defined proper behavior revolved around the value, both moral and economic, of cattle. Proto-Indo-European mythology was at its core the worldview of a male-centered cattle-raising people, not necessarily cattle nomads, but certainly people who held sons and cattle in the highest esteem. Why were cattle and sons so important? Now we go to domesticated animals and Pontic Caspian ecology. Until about 5200 to 5000 BCE, most of the people who lived in the steppes north of the Black and Caspian seas possessed no domesticated animals at all. They depended instead on gathering nuts and wild plants, fishing and hunting wild animals. In other words, they were foragers. But the environment they were able to exploit profitably was only a small fraction of the total steppe environment. The archaeological remains of their camps are found almost entirely in river valleys. Riverine gallery forests provided shelter, shade, firewood, building materials, deer, aurochs, European wild cattle, and wild boar. Fish supplied an important part of the diet. Wider river valleys like the Dnieper or Don had substantial gallery forests, kilometers wide. Smaller rivers had only scattered groves. The wide grassy plateaus between the river valleys, the great majority of the steppe environment, were forbidding places occupied only by wild equids and saigai antelope. The foragers were able to hunt the wild equids, including horses. The wild horses of the steppes were stout legged, barrel chested, stiff maned animals that probably looked very much like modern Przewalski horses and the only truly wild horses left in the world. The most efficient hunting method would have been to ambush horse bands in a ravine, and the easiest opportunity would have been when they came into the river valleys to drink or to find shelter. In the steppe regions where wild horses were most numerous, wild equid hunting was common. Often it supplied most of the foragers' terrestrial meat diet. The Pontic Caspian steppes are at the western end of a continuous steppe belt which rolls east all the way to Mongolia. It is possible, if one is so inclined, to walk 5,000 kilometers from the Danube Delta across the center of the Eurasian continent to Mongolia without even leaving the steppes. But a person on foot in the Eurasian steppes feels very small. Every footfall raises the scent of crushed sage, and a puff of tiny white grasshopper skips ahead of your boot. Although the flowers that grow among the fesk and feathergrass, festuca and stipa, make a wonderful boiled tea, the grass is inedible, and outside the forested river valleys, there is not much else to eat. The summer temperature frequently rises to 110 to 150 degree Fahrenheit, although it is dry heat and usually there is a breeze, so it is surprisingly tolerable. Winter, however, kills quickly. The howling snowy winds drive temperatures below minus 35 degree Fahrenheit, minus 37 degrees Celsius. Huh? Okay. The bitter cold steppe winters, think North Dakota, is the most serious limiting factor for humans and animals. Humans and animals, हाँ, बराबर पड़ा. More restricting even than water. Since there are shallow lakes in most parts of Eurasian steppes, the dominant mammal of the interior steppes at the time of our account begins was the wild horse Equus caballus. In the moister, lusher western steppes of Ukraine, north of the Black Sea, the North Pontic steppes, there was another smaller equid that ranged into the lower Danube Valley and down to central Anatolia, Equus hydrantinus. The last one hunted to extinction between 4000 and 3000 BCE. In the drier, more arid steppes of the Caspian Depression was a third ass-like, long-eared equid, the onager Equus hemionus, now endangered in the wild. Onagers then lived in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Iran, and in the Caspian Depression. Pontic-Caspian foragers hunted all three. The Caspian Depression was itself another important aspect of the Pontic-Caspian environment.
Can we say something real quick about the horses? Of course, he's taken care not to mention that the onager existed all the way through the Indus Valley civilization down to the Hakara Delta in Kutch. So that's another huge, natural habitat of onagers of Equus hemionus. He stopped it at Iran. Second thing is that he says in the steppe regions where wild horses were most numerous, wild equid hunting was most common and often supplied most of the foragers' terrestrial meat diet. This is actually good that he acknowledges it because, of course, in the Rig Veda, besides Ashwamedha, there is no evidence of killing or butchering horses for meat. I mean, Ashwamedha is the only sacrifice and it's only of one horse. It's not of many horses. Whereas in the steppe, in all of these places, they find the remains of many horses together. It means they've been butchered together. There is no evidence of killing or butchering horses for meat or horse meat diet in ISOEC sites, even though there is cattle meat, of course, or the Rig Veda, and not even as an ancestral memory trace. So, for example, Babur and all these guys, Babur the Mughal, he used to write poetry in which he used to talk about the food of his land. He used to write, the almonds of Central Asia, the musk melons, and this and that. People tend to refer to these things in their poetry, whereas the Rig Veda doesn't even have one mention of tasty horses or anything like that.
No, so the point is?
The point is that, it's the same point here, that the Rig Veda doesn't carry any trace of a civilization that either ate horse meat or used to sacrifice horses in large numbers.
No, exactly. That is the point. The horse was rare. That's why the horse is barely mentioned in the old Rig Veda, and it gets most of the mentions of the sacrifices are in the new Rig Veda.
Right.
So he's right. Where has he mentioned any?
No, I'm saying that part is right. That part he is right. That he's saying that it's not right in the sense it's fine that he says it. That it's a good thing for us that he mentions that there is a very strong horse diet, terrestrial meat diet of horse meat in the Pontic Caspian steppe, which is not there in the Rig Veda. That's a good thing. That's just the thing I was pointing out.
Yeah, that is obvious. Now we know the horse is barely existent in India. The only evidence of the horse you will find is only around the late Harappan period. Maybe the latter half of the mid Harappan to the late Harappan period. That is quite logical. So
yeah.
So that in fact, if it goes beyond that, then तो we don't know how the hell any theory is true. Out of India भी नहीं सच हो सकती है और आर्यन इन्वेजन भी नहीं सच हो सकती है. तो फिर तो किसी और की कोई theory नहीं पैदा करनी पड़ेगी उसके लिए फिर. क्योंकि then तो everything goes confused. But we are quite clear that they talk about a specific horse, and that horse is, I think, Equus caballus, right? This is the horse they talk about.
Yeah, who talks about? I'm sorry. How do we know that Ashwa always meant that?
But in fact, the horse that they talk about, the war horse, the horse that they talk about and they trace from the steppes is very specific. From the horse bones, they know that. From the horse bones, they know that. So that is the horse that they find, and that is the horse that moves around. That's exactly the point. And that is the horse they talk about in India also. Nothing else. वैसे तो wild horses तो India में भी मिलेंगे.
So that's another thing that we had discussed with Talagiri. Remember on his thing that did the word like Ashwa, did it mean onager, and then later it became applied to Equus caballus?
No, so the Talagiri's answer was very clear. Talagiri's answer was that the importance of this particular horse increases later on when it is brought into India, and that's when the Indians realize that acha, this is kind of important for us. That is the whole point, right?
What he care? But we were talking about the evolution of the word, right? Ashwa and Haya. That Haya meant actually a higher form of steed, like a superior form of steed. And we were comparing it with Armenian, where their cognate is Esh and Hai. And Esh is what they use for donkey, which is what we use. Ashwa right now is horse in Sanskrit. So could Ashwa have meant donkey or at least onager previously?
It could have. It could
Yeah.
have, but most of the mentions of the Ashwamedha Yagya in a very specific way are also in the latter books. So I don't know how anything changes.
Okay.
I don't understand. I mean,
I
I've
mean,
read the Rig Veda, that's why I'm telling you. So it doesn't change anything. What he's saying is spot on. Nothing changes in what he's saying. It is actually spot on. It is spot on from the Rig Vedic perspective. Literally from the Rig Vedic perspective, it is spot on.
what exactly are you referring to? What he's saying is spot on. Which statement here?
I mean, the part that the horse bones are found in these parts is actually spot on. There is nothing wrong in what he's saying. Because that is what
In
is
the steppe,
found.
that's what I said. It's a good thing that he said. No? You're talking about the statement. In the steppe regions where wild horses were most numerous, wild equid hunting was common. Often it supplied most of the forager's terrestrial meat diet. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, he's not saying it is found in India. So he's not even mentioning that.
Yeah.
In India, horse bones or the consumption of horse as a rare animal is only going to be found in the New Rig Veda, which is exactly what happens. Because the horse is brought into India at a later period. This particular horse, again, I'm talking about a particular horse, and that horse then becomes, because of its rarity, and it's like any rare commodity. I mean, the evidence is also in the Ramayana. In one verse in the Ramayana, when that punishment was given, I mean, the value comparison of a horse to a cow was the horse was 100 times more valuable than the cow. Even in the Ramayana, by the way. Inside the Ramayana, there is a direct verse. So that's how important the horse was. And it's very simple. Like the diamond today. Why is the diamond very important now? Because there is a created scarcity. Na? वो लोग एक scarcity create करते हैं कि it is so rare. तो वो scarcity है करके. तो इंडिया में horse इतना important क्यों था? One of the reasons might have been because it is rare. कि इंडिया में मिलता ही नहीं है. And obviously now I think Abhijit did a great presentation where he showed कि इंडिया में horse breed ही नहीं कर सकते थे. हमारे पास land ही नहीं था उसके लिए. सिर्फ other than that वो छोटा सा टोटा हमारे कंट्री में, other parts of the country were not even suitable for breeding those kinds of horses. So it is very natural. Actually, everything falls in place, or the entire flow of the evidence. In fact, this quest of Indians trying to find this particular horse bone in India is weird. In fact, I feel अगर वो horse bone मिल गई तो it will throw the cat amongst the pigeons और सारा ही confuse हो जाएंगे. सारा सब कुछ सत्यानाश हो जाएगा. ना Aryan invasion will make sense. Now out of India will make sense. Nothing will make sense, because if you find horse bones, let's say in 6000 BC of this particular kind, just think about it, and it's not mentioned in the old Rig Veda, then the chronology of the Rig Veda is wrong. I think it is wrong then. Then the entire premise of the chronology of the Rig Veda itself is wrong. Everything is wrong then. So it is not going to, and no wonder we don't find horse bones in India. No wonder. ऐसा तो है नहीं ना कि हम लोग अभी आप देखो ना, ओडिशा में अभी आर्कियोलॉजिकल डिग्स हो रहे हैं बहुत मेजर तरीके से, उधर भी हॉर्स बोन्स नहीं मिलती हैं एक पर्टिकुलर काइंड. एंड इट इज एग्जैक्टली इन दिस पीरियड ऑफ 2200 BC. उधर भी नहीं मिल रही है हॉर्स बोन्स. दे डोंट फाइंड इट. दे फाइंड शीप, दे फाइंड अदर कैटल, दे फाइंड ऑल दोस थिंग्स. हॉर्स बोन नहीं मिलती है, बहुत रेयरली मिलती है. मतलब, and even in BB Lal's distribution, if you remember, the top was what? Goat and all that. Then cattle. I mean, अपनी बोस इंडिकस और ये, क्योंकि तभी तो दूसरी कोई गाय होती ही नहीं थी, सिर्फ बोस इंडिकस होती थी हमारे यहाँ पे. और उसके बाद नीचे आके एक्विड है. और उसमें भी इफ यू रिमेंबर, इट वाज क्लियरली मेंशन्ड कि ये एक्वस कैबुलस था वो. इफ यू रिमेंबर, इट वाज नॉट डोंकी एंड एस. अगर डोंकी एंड एस होता था तो वो सेपरेटली मेंशन होते थे उसमें, इफ यू रिमेंबर. So these things are very normal. I think it is absolutely logical what is happening here. Anyway, I'll read further. The Caspian Depression was itself a sign of another important aspect of the Pontic Caspian environment, its instability. The Black and Caspian seas were not placid and unchanging. Between the 1400 and 12,000 BCE, the warming climate that ended the last ice age melted the northern glaciers and the permafrost, releasing their combined meltwater in a torrential surge that flowed south into the Caspian basin. The late ice age Caspian ballooned into a vast interior sea designated the Kwalianian Sea. For 2000 years, the northern shoreline stood near Saratov on the Middle Volga and Orenburg on the Ural River, restricting east-west movement south of the Ural Mountains. The Khalnian Sea separated the already noticeably different late glacial forager cultures that prospered east and west of the Ural Mountains. Around 11,000 to 9,000 BCE, the water finally rose high enough to overflow catastrophically through a southwestern outlet, the Maniac Depression north of the North Caucasus Mountains, and a violent flood poured into the Black Sea, which was then well below the world ocean level. The Black Sea basin filled up until it overflowed, also through a southwestern outlet, the narrow Bosporus Valley, and finally poured into the Aegean. By 8000 BCE, the Black Sea, now about the size of California and 7,000 feet deep, was in equilibrium with the Aegean and the world ocean. The Caspian had fallen back into its own basin and remained isolated thereafter. The Black Sea became the Pontus Euxenios. How do you pronounce it? Euxenios of the Greeks, from which we derive the term Pontic for the Black Sea region in general. The North Caspian Depression, once the bottom of the northern end of the Khalnian Sea, was left an enormous flat plain of salty clays, incongruous beds, and seashells and sands dotted with blackish lakes and covered with dry steppes that graded into red sand deserts, the Ryan Pesky, just north of the Caspian Sea. Herds of saiga antelopes, onagers, and horses were hunted across these saline plains by small bands of post glacial Mesolithic and Neolithic hunters. But by the time the sea receded, they had become very different culturally and probably linguistically on the eastern and western sides of the Ural Caspian frontier. When domesticated cattle were accepted by societies west of the Urals, they were rejected by those east of the Urals who remained foragers for thousands of years. Domesticated cattle and sheep started a revolutionary change in how humans exploited the Pontic Caspian steppe environment. Because cattle and sheep were cultured like humans, they were part of everyday work and worry in a way never approached by wild animals. Humans identified with their cattle and sheep, wrote poetry about them, and used them as a currency in marriage gifts, debt payments, and the calculation of social status. And they were grass processors. They converted plains of grass, useless and even hostile to humans, into wool, felt, clothing, tents, milk, yogurt, cheese, meat, marrow, and bone, the foundation of both life and wealth. Cattle and sheep herds can grow rapidly with a little luck. Vulnerable to bad weather and theft, they can also decline rapidly. Herding was a volatile, boom bust economy and require a flexible, opportunistic social organization. Because cattle and sheep are easily stolen, unlike grain crops, cattle raising people tend to have problems with thieves, leading to conflict and warfare. This is a very important point. Please keep this in the back of your head. Under these circumstances, brothers tend to stay close together. In Africa, among Bantu speaking tribes, the spread of cattle raising seems to have led to the loss of matrilineal social organizations and spread of male centered patrilineal kinship systems. Stock breeding also created entirely new kinds of political power and prestige by making possible elaborate public sacrifices and gifts to animals. The connection between animals, brothers, and power was the foundation on which new forms of male centered ritual and politics developed among Indo European speaking societies. This is why the cow and brothers occupied such a central place in Indo European myths relating to how the world began. So, where did the cattle come from? When did people living in the Pontic Caspian steppes begin to keep and care for herds of dappled cows? Now, here's a point I want to raise. What was that paper, Karthik? You had also shared it. I had read it a long time ago about the movement of cattle. What was that paper? I forgot the name of that paper. My memory with names is so bad. There was this very specific paper. क्या था यार वो?
एक तो है उपाध्याय का नेचर में 2017, you know, and the other one
वो बोस इंडिकस की मूवमेंट का.
वो तो मैंने नहीं शेयर किया था. I think maybe Divya had shared it.
यार वो कौन सा पेपर था यार? Shit. Man, so bad. I need to start eating some things to make my memory sharper. I don't remember that paper. I'm very sorry. I will, you know what? I'll do one thing. I'll find that paper out and leave it in the comments. But I just want to make that point and let us have a discussion again. So, if the cattle movement, as we have seen, we see that cattle moved a long time ago from one place to the other. This is no proof of out of India. I am just putting it out there. But then what does it say about these tendencies that he's talking about, these cultural tendencies? So what are the probabilities of these cultural tendencies independently developing in different areas is my question to you both, Vrushal and Karthik.
I would say huge. I mean, this is true of any, like as he said, oh, Bantu, they are not Indo-Europeans, but they also had the same thing develop. Now, the cultural tendency of like they are herders, therefore there's a high chance of the herd getting stolen. Therefore, there's a, high probability of conflict and warfare. Therefore, you need a tight male kinship system, and brothers also become important. Cattle are also important as part of the economy. This is like everywhere that they are doing herding, this would be the case.
Vrushal, what are your views?
Yeah, I agree with that. And you're dealing with as far as like the cattle itself goes, you're dealing with an animal that's got certain traits, right? And so people are going to respond in very similar ways to when they get to an optimized domesticated system. It's going to look very similar, right? Because you're responding to an animal that behaves very consistently in the same way. So yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's very possible that in isolated societies could come up with the same very similar systems.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But keep this in mind, this point in the back of your head. So now we'll read further. The first farmer forager frontier in the Pontic Caspian region. The first cattle herders in the Pontic Caspian region arrived about 5800 to 5700 BCE from the Danube Valley, and they probably spoke languages unrelated to Proto Indo European. They were the leading edge of a broad movement of farming people that began around 6200 BCE when pioneers from Greece and Macedonia plunged north into the temperate forests of the Balkans and the Carpathian Basin. Domesticated sheep and cattle had been imported from Anatolia to Greece by their ancestors before, and now were herded northward into forested southeastern Europe. Genetic research has shown that the cattle did interbreed with the native European aurochs and the huge wild cattle of Europe, but only the male calves traced on Y chromosome of aurochs were kept, perhaps because they could improve the herd size or resistance to disease without affecting milk yields. The cows probably already kept for their milk all were descended from mothers that had come from Anatolia, traced through mitochondrial DNA. mtDNA मतलब वही है ना mitochondrial DNA ना कार्तिक? Right.
And I mean, I can just quickly make the point he's completely wrong about this, and that may be because he wrote this in 2007.
Yes.
But after
this
that,
book is written in 2007.
Yeah, I mean, there's been completely new genetic studies like SCHIEU. I mean, I don't know how you pronounce that name. SCHIEU in Biomed Central 2015.
SCHIEU. Yeah.
SCHIEU has, basically has shown that cattle came from Anatolia to Europe not in 5800, 5700, but 6400 BCE. Okay. And the genetic isolation between sort of the West Asian cattle and the European cattle started only after 5500 BCE. So close to his date when he says they came in, that's actually when they started getting isolated. There was a constant stream of cattle, going from West Asia into Europe between 6400 BCE to 5500 BCE. And after that, isolation started. And constant stream sort of means that they kept getting renewed. The same genomes get renewed and renewed and renewed. Right? And he says also that...
Just for the record, this book was written in 2007 and there was another preprint in 2010 or 11.
Acha. Ho sakta hai.
That's it.
Anyway, so he's showing also this SCHIEU paper shows that, I mean, we'll come to this later on in the chapter. He talks a lot about this Chris culture. But what the SCHIEU paper shows is that actually cattle did not spread to Northern Europe via the Chris culture. It spread to the Northern Europe via something called the LBK culture, linear ceramic or something like that, which is, I mean, they were neighbors of that, of these people, of this Chris culture, but they were not the same people. And the new breeds of cattle that were specific to Europe start to kind of emerge from Switzerland in about 5600 BCE. So there's a few, khokla things with this timeline here. So also it's been shown by Upadhyay 2017 that there's a contribution of female aurochs very strongly into modern European cattle, which happened in Italy and Switzerland. So the mitochondrial evidence, what he has described, is not quite correct. Anyway,
Okay. Chalo. I'll read further. Huh. Wild rock cows probably were relatively poor milk producers and might have been temperamentally difficult to milk. So, Neolithic European farmers made sure that all their cows were born of long domesticated mothers, but they did not mind a little crossbreeding with native wild bulls to obtain large domestic bull. Comparative studies of chain migration among recent and historical pioneer farmers suggest that in the beginning, the farming and herding groups that first moved into temperate southeastern Europe probably spoke similar dialects and recognized one another as cultural cousins. The thin native population of foragers was certainly seen as culturally and linguistically other, regardless of how the two cultures interacted. After an initial rapid burst of exploration, sites at Anza-Begovo, Karanovo 1, Gura Basilui, Cersei, pioneer groups became established in the middle Danube plains north of Belgrade, with the type site of Sarajevo and other similar Neolithic settlements are located. The central Danubian lowland produced two streams of migrants that leapfrogged in one direction down the Danube into Romania and Bulgaria, and in the other up of the Mureș and Koros rivers in Transylvania. Both migration streams created similar pottery and tool types assigned to the Kris culture. This is the migration of pioneer farmers into Greece and across Europe 6500 to 5500 BCE, including the colonization of the Eastern Carpathian Piedmont by the Kris culture. So here's your Anatolian Neolithic going into Starcevo, and from here it goes into three different directions, and another one goes into the West Mediterranean Neolithic. The first farmers in the Pontic region, the Kris culture. The name Kris is Romania and Koros in eastern Hungary are two variants of the same river name and the same prehistoric culture. The northern Kris people moved up the Hungarian rivers into the mountains of Transylvania and then pushed over the top of the Carpathian ridges into an ecologically rich and productive Piedmont region east of the Carpathians. They herded their cattle and sheep down the eastern slopes into the upper valleys of the Sirit and Prut rivers about 1500 to 5700 BCE. Kris carbon radiocarbon dates are unaffected by reservoir effects because they were not measured on human bone. The other migration stream in the lower Danube Valley moved into the same eastern Carpathian Piedmont from the south. These two groups created a northern and a southern variant of the East Carpathian Kris culture, which survived from about 5800 to about 5300. Kris farms in the East Carpathian Piedmont were the source of the first domesticated cattle in the northern North Pontic region. The Kris uh, the Kris pioneers moved eastward through the East Steppe zone in the Piedmont northwest of the Black Sea, where rainfall agriculture was possible, avoiding the lowland steppes on the coast of the lower courses of the rivers that ran through them into the sea. This is very interesting. Just look at these artifacts. I was just looking at some of them and then comparing it again with the excavations in India, and I was trying to see similarities and patterns. So one thing that I remembered was this and this. I don't know. Is my cursor visible on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So I found these two to be very interesting. These two and this one. Radiocarbon dates. I mean, I'm just leaving it here. I don't think so I can read this. This is next to impossible to read, but I'm just leaving it for you guys on the screen so you can later on take a screenshot and maybe refer to them.
yeah, and quick point there, like note that the LBK and the Kris culture are different, no?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Again, I'm going to leave this for a few seconds so that you guys don't have problems taking a screenshot if you are reading or watching this later. Okay, now I'll read further. Archaeologists have identified at least 30 Chris settlement sites in the East Carpathian Piedmont, a region of forest interspersed with natural meadows cut by deep, twisting river valleys. Figure 8.3. Most Chris farming hamlets were built on the second terraces of rivers overlooking the floodplain. Some were located on steep sided promontories above the floodplain, Susieva, and a few farms were located on the high forested ridges between the rivers Sakharovka 1. Houses were one room built with timber posts and beams, plaster on wattle walls, and probably reed thatched roofs. Larger homes, sometimes oval in outline, were built over dugout floors and contained a kitchen with a domed clay oven. Lighter, smaller structures were built on the surface with an open fire in the center. Most villages consisted of just a few families, perhaps in living in perhaps 3 to 10 smoky thatched pit dwellings, surrounded by agricultural fields, gardens, plum orchards, and pastures for the animals. No Chris cemeteries are known. We do not know what they did with their dead. We do know, however, that they still prized and wore white shell bracelets made from important spondylus, an Asian species, I mispronounced, that was first made into bracelets by the original pioneers of early Neolithic Greece. Chris families cultivated barley, millet, peas, and four varieties of wheat: emmer, einkorn, spelt, and bread wheats. Wheat and peas were not native to southeastern Europe. They were exotics, domesticated in the Near East, carried into Greece by sea-borne immigrant farmers, and propagated through Europe from Greece. Residues inside pots suggest that grains were often eaten in the form of a soup thickened with flour. Charred fragments of Neolithic bread from Germany and Switzerland suggested that wheat flour was also made into a batter that was fried or baked, but the grains were moistened and pressed into small whole grain baked loaves. Chris harvesting sickles used a curved red deer antler inset with flint blades 5 to 10 centimeter long, angled so that their corners form teeth. The working corners show sickle gloss from cut-in grain. The same type of sickle and flint blade is found in all early Neolithic farming settlements of the Danube Balkan Carpathians. Most of the meat in the East Carpathian Chris diet was from cattle and pigs, with red deer as a close third, followed by sheep, a distribution of species reflecting the largely forested environment. Their small bred cows and pigs were slightly different from the local wild aurochs or wild boar, but not markedly so. The sheep, however, were exotic newcomers and invasive species like wheat and peas brought into the steep Carpathian valleys by strange people whose voices made a new kind of sound. Remember this point he makes. This is a leap of faith, but remember it.
Yeah, इसको कैसा पता they made a new kind of sound?
So इसके लिए मैंने बोला ना वैसे ऐसे. And remember this map, huh? I'm sorry I cannot make it larger. ये बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है यार. इसको बड़ा नहीं कर सकते, समस्या है इस बुक में, मगर कुछ कर नहीं सकता मैं. Chris ceramic vessels were handmade by coiling method and included plain pots for cooking and storage, and a variety of fine wares with polished reddish brown surfaces, tureens, bowls, and cups on pedestals. Decorative designs were incised with a stick on the clay surface before firing or were impressed with a fingernail. Very rarely they were painted in broad brown stripes. The shapes and designs made by Chris settlers in the East Carpathians were characteristic of periods 3 and 4 of the Chris culture. Older sites of stages 1 and 2 are found only in eastern Hungary, the Danube Valley, and Transylvania. Chris farmers never penetrated east of the Prut-Dniester watershed. In the Dniester Valley, they came face to face with a dense population of local foragers, known today as the Bug-Dniester culture, named after the two river valleys, Dniester and South Bug, where most of their sites are found. The Bug-Dniester culture was the filter through which farming and stock breeding economies were introduced to the Pontic Caspian societies further east. Again, this part is very important. Remember this bit also. I'll explain later. I'll tell you why I'm pointing this out. The Chris people were different from their Bug-Dniester neighbors in many ways. Chris flint tool kits featured large blades and few scrapers, whereas the foragers used microlithic blades and many scrapers. Most Chris villages were on the better drained soils of the second terrace, convenient for farming, and most foragers lived on the floodplain convenient for fishing. Whereas Chris woodworkers used polished stone axes, the foragers used chipped flint axes. Chris pottery was distinct both in the way it was made and its style of decoration, and Chris farmers raised and ate various exotic foods, including mutton, which has a distinctive taste. Four cylindrical copper beads were found at the Chris site of Celeste, dated 5800 to 5600 BCE. They show an early awareness of the metallic minerals in the mountains of Transylvania and the Balkans copper, something the foragers of southeastern Europe had never ever noticed. Some archaeologists have speculated that the East Carpathian Chris culture could have been an acculturated population of local foragers who had adopted a farming economy rather than immigrant pioneers. This is unlikely given the numerous similarities between the material culture and economy of Chris sites in the Danube Valley and the East Carpathians, and the sharp differences between East Carpathian and Chris culture and the local foragers. But it really is of no consequence. No one seriously believes that the East Carpathian Chris people were genetically pure anyway. The important point in that is that the people who lived in Chris villages in the East Carpathians were culturally Chris in almost all the material signs of their identity, and given how they got there, almost certainly in non-material signs like as language. Well, Chris culture name without any doubt from the Danube Valley. Now remember these 2 points. Why I said the Bugmeister culture was the filter through which farming and stock breeding economies were introduced into Pontic Caspian societies farther east. I'm just trying to, again, when I had spoken to you guys last time, I had raised this one point, if you guys remember, that these are the most important chapters of this book. If you are someone who believes that OIT is true, if you believe OIT is true, these are the most important chapters. Please understand this movement very carefully. This is the movement internally in Europe. Because if you don't understand this movement internally inside Europe, you will not understand your case for out of India. I am sorry to say that if your case is just up to Iran, I'm sorry, that is not a case. I'm just being very open and honest and very clear about it. If you are just going to show from India to Iran and you're going to draw a massive hypothesis like out of India hypothesis, I'm sorry, I don't buy. No, you can disagree with me and you can say, no, Kushal, you are wrong. We think that is enough. This is my honest opinion. I believe this is where the OIT side falters. I think this chapter is a treasure trove of information to understand the internal movements of Europe, how these cultures were interacting with each other, and what culture. Okay, so here's my question to both Karthik and Vrushal. So these whatever ध्रुयूज थे जो गए बाहर, सो जो ध्रुयूज गए और फिर ध्रुयूज के जो एक पार्ट ईरान से निकले बाहर, वो कौन सा कल्चर लेके गए? डोंट यू थिंक इट मैटर्स अ लॉट? व्हाट वाज द कल्चर ऑफ दोस पीपल? Because that is when you draw the narrative, right? If it is out of India, what was the culture of the people who went out of India and interacted with these people? Until and unless you don't understand the cultural similarities or contrasts of these people who are moving from India, if you believe in out of India, and these people and this khichdi that is going on there, then only will you understand, right?
It's just going to be tough because the khichdi is pretty complex in Europe side, right? It's a lot more complex, I think, than it is on Indus Valley, Ganga Plain, I think, even, right? I mean, we don't know too much about it on this side from archaeological side, but they have a lot of archaeological one. But the more data they have, it's kind of a little bit more complex. But I think you're right in the sense that if you want to convince somebody, you have to go take that extra distance, even if your chronology matches and you can show that, something went out of India up to Iran before the claim or whatever it is. You're not going to be able to convince, because both sides are doing the same, right? It's what you're saying. Like, AIT claimed they don't talk about Indian evidence too much, right? And OIT is not talking about European evidence at all, actually, right? And so the two need to converge and kind of connect towards each other. But I just think it's going to be tough.
I mean, some pieces are definitely there, right? So we know from that Brushaki 2016 paper, the one that I keep sharing with the red and the blue circles, that people
Yes.
from Mehrgarh moved up to Western Iran, around 7,000 to 6,500 BCE. There's another paper by Lazaridis in 2016 who shows that. So there was something called the 8.2 kiloyear event, which is about 6,200 BCE. So 8,200 years ago, there was a very sharp decline in global temperatures, and only after that sort of, you know, began to lift. The effects began to lift, and things began to warm again. There were movements north from from Iran and Armenia and all that through the Caucasus into the steppe. So this Lazaridis paper has shown, conclusively that people from the Western Iranian stock, the same people, probably with a lot of input from Mehrgarh, moved into the steppe, to the Volga region around 5,500 to 4,500 BCE.
This
So
is very
Uttara to Hayat.
important. This
Yeah,
this part is very important. The Volga region, because Volga region is the place where a lot of what happens.
yeah,
That is the area, right? The Volga region.
right.
And in the Volga region, it is, if I am pronounced, the Danube Valley, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's much easier. We keep a map up, for example, 8 point, like
Yeah,
figure
so
eight point
can
one.
you do this? Because यार मैं यहाँ पे खोलूंगा ना तो दिक्कत होगी. So can we do this then? One of you always keeps a map out on that area on your side, so we can always flip up the map, and I keep changing the screen share whenever we want to make that point.
You want me to open the Google Maps or?
Um,
Because नहीं तो मैं see मेरे if you guys share at your end ना, I can stop my screen share and bring the map up every time we need to. That's what I'm trying to say.
okay, I can just find a. God, this
Because
one.
this
Because
is very
even
important. This 3-4 pages are very important.
Hmm.
What he's talking about is supremely important.
Yeah, let's see if I can find a big one. Tools.
Did you find a map?
Still looking. I mean, looking for one that shows everything we need. Both
Oh.
hai, like what.
So
need
do we
one.
keep it to the next time then?
Okay, maybe.
Yeah, okay. चलो, we'll go forward. We'll keep it to the next time, because ये तो बार-बार आने वाला है ना ये area, अभी आगे भी आएगा. So we'll keep it to the next time. We'll cover some more bits. Chalo, let us read further. Language of the Chris culture. If the Starcevo Chris Caranovo migrants were at all similar to pioneer farmers in North America, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world, it is very likely that they retained the language spoken in their parent villages in northern Greece. ये याद रखना, ये point याद रखना. Please remember this. Forager languages were more apt to decline in the face of agricultural immigration. Farmers had a higher birth rate, their settlements were larger, and were occupied permanently. Again, ये point भी याद रखना. Remember these points. I'm purposely separating the two because they're two separate points in my view. They produced food surpluses that were easier to store over the winter. Owning and feeding cultured animals has always been seen as an utterly different ethos from the hunting wild ones, as Ian Hodder emphasized. The material and ritual culture and economy of the immigrant farmers were imposed on the landscapes of Greece and southeastern Europe and persisted there, whereas the external signs of forager identity disappeared. The language of the foragers might have had substrate effects on that of the farmers, but it is difficult to imagine a plausible scenario under which it could have completed with farmers' language. What languages were spoken by the Starcevo, Kris, and Karanova one pioneers? The parent language of all of them was spoken in the Thessalian plain of Greece, where the first Neolithic settlements were founded after about 6700 to 6500 BCE, probably by seafarers who island hopped from western Anatolia in open boats. Catherine Perles has convincingly demonstrated that the material culture and economy of the first farmers in Greece was transplanted from the Near East or Anatolia. Always remember this point also. These are important points to remember. An origin somewhere in western Anatolia is suggested by similarities in pottery, flint tools, ornaments, female figurines, pintadera stamps, lip labrets, and other traits. The migrants leapfrogged to the Thessalian plain, the richest agricultural land in Greece, almost certainly on the basis of information from scouts, probably Aegean fishermen, who told their relatives in Anatolia about the destination. The population of farmers in Thessaly grew rapidly. At least 120 early Neolithic settlements stood on the Thessalian plain by 6200 to 6000 BCE when pioneers began to move north into the temperate forests of southeastern Europe. The Neolithic villages of Thessaly provided the original breeds of domesticated sheep, cattle, wheat, and barley, as well as red on white pottery, female centered domestic rituals, bracelets and beads made of Aegean spondylus shell, flint tool types, and other traditions that were carried into the Balkans. The language of Neolithic Thessaly probably was a dialect of a spoken language in Western Anatolia about 6500 BCE. Again, remember this point too. This is a very important point. Keep all these things in your mind. Simplification and leveling should have occurred among the first colonist dialects in Thessaly, so the 120 villages occupied 500 years later spoke a language that had passed through a bottleneck and probably were just beginning to separate again into strongly differentiated dialects. The tongue spoken
See,
by the first, yeah.
this is actually goes exactly against something which he said earlier against the Anatolian hypothesis. So his argument against the Anatolian hypothesis, how could it have come how could it have come in 6000 BC? Because that's the date for PIE in Anatolian hypothesis. If it had come by 6500 BC, it would have been very much branched and diversified. He uses some phrase like it's bushy, branched, and multi-pronged or something like that. And we would not have been able to trace the linguistics back to common words. But right now, he's given an explanation of why it would not have been bushy branched, because even if it was in Anatolia, if it was many branched and all of that, but only some of them came into Greece, so it forms a bottleneck, and you get simplification inside Greece. So it's not that languages only diversify and become more and more and more complicated. Sometimes you have a movement of people, and like he was saying in the earlier chapter, how migrants tend to kind of homogenize a language. So the way that, for example, Chinese people that migrate to Singapore, whichever part of China they'll come from, but they'll start to speak a very similar Chinese over there. Or Indians who migrate to the US, whichever part of India they come from, because they all have to understand each other, they will sort of create a standard Indian American Hindi. So ऐसा तो हो सकता है that some part of PIE came in from Anatolia into here.
Yeah, मगर evidence क्या है? Honestly, I'm just trying to think. I'm just trying to think out loud. कैसे evidence कैसे देगा कोई आदमी?
Evidence to Renfrew there hai na. He's given a lot of evidence for this. The main argument of David Anthony and J.P. Mallory against Renfrew is that it was so old it could not have been pi, right? But but honestly, the way that he's talking about the dynamics of language change with migration, it could very well have been pi. What was the argument against it that Anthony and Mallory put up? That if it had come so long ago, it would have diverged into many, many, many different families, not only the few that we see now, right? So relatively few are there now in Europe. There's Germanic, Celtic, Italic, um, and Balto-Slavic and Grecian, right? That's it. But what they're saying is, if it had come in 6500 BC only, if Pi had come, it would have diverged into many, many, many small, small dialects, and different branches. But here he's giving the reason why that need not necessarily have been so. If only one particular branch of PIE had come from Turkey into Greece, right? That's actually a narrowing of the number of branches. And that whole dynamics of immigration, where he talks about simplification and leveling that would have occurred among the first colonist dialects in Thessaly. So that the 120 villages occupied 500 years later spoke a language that had passed through a bottleneck. So instead of many branches, it would have been simplified by the fact that these people came there, and was probably just beginning to separate again into strongly differentiated dialects.
Yeah, but the problem lies in the grammar, right? The problem was in that, what was that लिस्ट जिसके ऊपर एनाटोलियन हाइपोथेसिस बेस्ड था, क्या नाम था उसका? वो 200 100 200 100
had some Hindi sounding name, na?
Yeah, क्या था यार उसका नाम? What nonsense यार, I'm so bad with freaking names. Shit यार, it had some weird Hindi sounding name.
Yeah.
क्या नाम था उसका? Completely over my head now. Totally blanked out. Swadesh. Swadesh. I kept on thinking Suhag. I was like, Suhag nahi tha, Swadesh. Yeah, the Swadesh list, na? Then you run into problems with the Swadesh list then. So this is not possible. Even for them. Then they will have problems in that Swadesh list. The Anatolian ones.
हो सकता है.
They rely on that. Anyways, we'll read further. The tongue spoken by the first Chris farmers in the East Carpathian foothills about 5800 to 5600 BCE was removed from the parent tongue spoken by the first settlers in Thessaly by less than 1,000 years, the same interval that separates modern American English from Anglo-Saxon. That was long enough for several old European Neolithic languages to have emerged from the Thessalian period, but they would have belonged to a single language family. That language family was not Indo-European. It came from the wrong place, Anatolia and Greece, at a wrong time. मतलब ये wrong place and wrong time का क्या मतलब है?
Yeah, how does he know that? It's not wrong. And you know what it's based on? It's based on that his stupid lists of which kind of plants were there in Pi, reconstructed Pi, which is just bogus, man. Bogus. Anyway.
This is a very wrong way to write, actually.
Yeah.
This line is wrong. This line is unfair, I believe.
Yeah.
Anyways, curiously, a fragment of that lost language might be preserved in the Proto-Indo-European term for bull, toros, which many linguists think was borrowed from an Afro-Asiatic term. The Afro-Asiatic superfamily generated both Egyptian and Semitic in the Near East, and one of its early languages might have been spoken in Anatolia by the earliest farmers. Perhaps the Chris people spoke a language of Afro-Asiatic type, and as they drove their cattle into the East Carpathian valleys, they called them something like Tor. See, I'll tell you what the problem is with Anthony. See, why he uses language like this is because he is not a linguist. Now, see, Pelsweg, they would never use such language.
No.
They would give at least a 10-page answer to this.
Yeah.
Which is why I made all of you read that book. जबकि ये book उसके पहले आई है, by the way. I still made you read that book before, is because then you will understand कि नहीं ऐसे नहीं है, linguist answer देते हैं. So the point is, the Asya Pelsweg has given an explanation for this. Why it cannot be that. If you remember, he has given that answer in that book. But this is the whole point with David Anthony. See, the problem is he did not have the benefit of that book, right? So we have to be fair to him in that sense that he wrote this book in 2007. But what this book has done, right, a lot of times this book to maybe appeal to a general audience, right, I think makes many leaps of faith.
Yeah, and makes many certain definitive claims of what are only probabilities at the best.
Yes, that absolutely. This is my problem. I think even OIT folks make some absolute claims where you can't make it. And this is my problem with this entire debate, honestly. The level of certainty on both sides is very dangerous, if you ask me. Like, how are people so certain? Mujhe nahi malum.
Hmm.
There's so many holes to fill, yaar. So many holes.
Yeah, and if these guys with all the resources and machinery of Western academia at their disposal have not been able to make a compelling case for AIT, then how can we say that we have made a compelling case for OIT when we are just basically
Best of luck to the case of
yeah,
OIT.
yeah.
And that is the thing. That's why I'm agnostic in this subject. I'm genuinely agnostic. I just don't know what is true because when I read both sides, right, like common sense use karenge na kitne holes milte hain. When you read it and see what, why do I do these sessions where I'm reading out loud, carefully, highlighting things? Is because then when you read slowly and then you have other people reading it with you, you find so many holes in the damn thing.
Yeah.
And the same thing you have. See, with Talagiri, I will say the most airtight hypothesis is Talagiri's. But his is also not conclusive, ना. अरे what happened after Iran? ऐसे थोड़ी ना होता. आपने बोल दिया यहाँ से वहां गए, मगर हो सकता है कि यहाँ से वहां गए मगर वहां से भी कुछ लोग आए होंगे ना उस टाइम पे. तो ये हो सकता है ये लैंग्वेज उनकी मिक्सचर हो. ये भी तो हो सकता है ना.
In fact, it's almost certainly was a mixture.
तो मेरा पॉइंट ये है कि आई थिंक प्रोटो इंडो यूरोपियन वाज अ खिचड़ी ऑफ टू साइड्स, हमारी साइड और वो साइड. मतलब वो थोड़े एनातोलिया से कुछ पता नहीं पंगु आ गए होंगे और हमारे यहाँ से कुछ जा रहे होंगे और ये दोनों की खिचड़ी बन गई होगी. I think the exclusivity in the OIT claim and the exclusivity in the AMT claim, I think that is bogus, if you ask me.
In fact, I don't even know what is meant by OIT anymore. I mean, like if it is some Vishwaguru OIT where these people went with nuclear weapons and Brahmastra and flew on Pushpak. I mean, like that's absurd. Obviously it's absurd. But the fact that a lot of cultural input came from India is definitely true at the same time. That at least from Indus Valley.
Yeah. That's I'm willing to accept that. Anyways, I think we'll wrap up today's discussion over here because I think it's at a perfect length because half chapter ho gaya hai, half
Okay.
chapter baki hai. We will wrap it up here because now we start a new section altogether, right? The bug Neister culture. So we'll pick it up next time. So we'll wrap up today's discussion, guys. I will see you guys next Saturday if you are part of the Ramayana discussions or next Sunday. So take care. Until then, bye.